is back to being a first-class citizen. From a customer's point of view, it means customers now have more choices about what platform they can use and run their favorite web applications on. We know there's more work to be done. Currently, APC on Windows uses a caching process, a cache per process rather than a single cache for multiple processes. Both customers and developers would like to have easy access to binary DLLs for the PECL libraries, and we would like to see better convergence between the threading models used by different architectures. We are committed to working long-term with the community to implement these enhancements and to continue supporting both the community developers and the customers who use their products. The PHP Core Engine community is just one of the examples of communities that we've identified as being areas where Microsoft can make significant contributions for the mutual benefit of our customers. We've also made contributions to more than 20 PHP application communities, including Drupal, MediaWiki, WordPress, and Gallery. These patches were designed to provide access to the SQL Server driver that Microsoft developed and also made available as an open source project. We've been active participants in the past year in the Apache Foundation's Project Cupid, where we have funded the work of a community developer, Steve Huston, and provided a test engineer and lab support for the project. Cupid is an open source implementation of the Advanced Message Queuing Protocol, which is a wire-lever protocol for managing the flow of data across business systems and is often used to create financial service applications. We've also engaged with the Samba community by participating in a variety of plugfests with that community and using the community's test tools internally to test our own implementations of the CIFS, SMB, and SMB2 protocols so that we can ensure good interoperability between Microsoft's products and the Samba community's implementations. The other open source effort that I would like to highlight today is perhaps our most famous community engagement to date, and this is the contribution of code that we made to the Linux kernel. The effort began last July when we submitted approximately 20,000 lines of code to the Linux kernel through the Linux driver project. This was the first time ever that Microsoft contributed code to an open source community under the GPL v2 license. Although in fairness to another Microsoft engineering team, our educational services engineers, they were at the same time releasing GPL v2 code to the Moodle community. It's important for me to mention this other Microsoft team's contributions for you to understand that it's not just the engineers in the Open Source Technology Center at Microsoft who are engaging with open source communities, but other engineering groups within Microsoft are doing so as well. These include not only the Education Services team, but Microsoft's IIS team and engineers from the Developer and Platform Evangelist Interoperability Group, among others. Our recognition of the benefits we can all derive from participating in open source collaborations is a growing phenomenon within Microsoft, and it is not limited to a narrow group within the company. Our original contributions of 20,000 lines of code to the Linux kernel was well received by both the Linux community and industry, but we all recognize that our initial contribution was only a beginning. This was the start of the hard work. We first needed to work with the community to ensure that every file and every line of code met the community's coding standards, and community members were gracious in helping us do this. Within weeks of our July contribution, more than 100 patches had come from community members to help us meet the coding standards, but more importantly, more deeply integrate our code into the Linux driver structure. During this time, some questioned whether we ourselves were participating actively enough in recrafting the code. But in point of fact, what we were doing was actively testing every one of those 100+ patches to ensure that our drivers would continue to build and continue to perform correctly. Such a level of change is guaranteed to break something, and such was the case with the flood of patches that we were receiving. But to everyone's credit, both at Microsoft and the community, we worked through every patch, contributed, fixing what was needed to be fixed, and continuing to make improvements and submitting patches back ourselves. It's worth noting here that the tests that we run include those that were developed by Martin Bly and his team in the Auto Test project, and that the community uses today to continue testing the nightly builds of Linux. Earlier this month, Greg Kroh-Hartman, the Linux subsystem maintainer I mentioned previously, and to whom most of our patches are submitted, visited our offices in Redmond. He spent part of the day talking with our Linux device driver writers, but also gave a presentation at which over 160 Microsoft engineers attended. An interesting point that he made was that engineers from many companies make up the contributions that come to the Linux kernel. He noted that the leading group of contributors is what he called amateurs. And by this, he just simply meant the largest group of developers who submit patches don't actually work for a company that hired them to submit those patches for the Linux kernel. Not surprisingly, number 2 on that list was Red Hat, and number 3 on the list was Intel. Microsoft was number 142. I'm actually proud of this start for 2 reasons. One, at 142 on the list, according to Greg, we were still ahead of some better-known Linux community names, including Canonical, the corporate entity for Ubuntu today. We may not be a Tier 1 contributor to the Linux kernel, but we are committed to being long-term contributors and expanding our participation. Second, and more importantly, our position on the list represents 11 patches that were accepted in the second half of 2009. That averages 2 patches per month. In addition to all the testing that we are doing, I believe that this shows our commitment to the community. Our patch contributions will certainly grow this year, not only in number, but in their significance and in their impact.